In the previous video, we had created the category transaction and added category id and category name to the attraction transaction structure. Let's see it running. F5. When analyzing the impact caused by the new definitions, GNexus informs us that it will have to create in the database a new table named category with the fields category id and category name. We can see that the data types to be created in the database match the domains on which the attributes were based, and also that the category id attribute will be auto-numbered. It also informs us that it will create an index by primary key for the category ID attribute. It will always create an index by primary key. We will talk about this later. If we now look at the report for the attraction table, it indicates that it is going to be modified. At the structure level, it shows that a new attribute, category id, will be added, and that the category name attribute will not be added as we expected. Category id is indicated as a foreign key, and for the same reason an index will be created for that attribute in the table. We will understand this later. This structuring of the tables to avoid duplications and thus inconsistencies between the data is called database normalization. Now that we have understood the role of the category id attribute in the attraction transaction, that is, that of a foreign key, let's go back to the impact analysis report and dwell on the warning notices. But first, if we go to the attraction structure, we see that there is a column that tells us for the stored attributes, not for the inferred ones, whether or not they can be left without an assigned value. It says whether it accepts null. Null is strictly a non-value. Let's focus exclusively on the foreign key attribute. The fact that it is not nullable means that a tourist attraction can never be inserted in the database without specifying a category. And since it is a foreign key, in addition, there must be a record in the category table with the ID placed there. But then, what will happen when GNexus reorganizes the attraction table to add the category id attribute, given that there are already two records in the table? What values will it assign to the category id attribute for each of those two records? It will have to leave them with an empty value, 0, since they cannot be null, because the nullable property is set to no. But if it did that, there would be an inconsistency, since there is no record with ID 0 in category. That is exactly what the first warning is informing us, that it will have to leave an empty value. But when doing so, the second warning appears, which tells us that the category table is referenced by the attraction table, and that at least one attribute that is a foreign key does not accept nulls. Note that it indicates that the new attribute will have a default value of 0. So if in the attraction table there are records, as in our case, it will have to add a record with ID 0 to the category table, so that the referential integrity does not fail. This is the only way to maintain consistency, that is, that every tourist attraction references an existing category. It will leave category name empty, that is, it will be a text without characters. We can change that initial value from 0 to 2, for example, so that it doesn't have to create the record with ID 0, because we are sure that category 2 exists. But if what we want is that there can be tourist attractions without a defined category, for example because their value is unknown at the moment, how can we do that? We simply set for the foreign key the value yes for the nullable property. This means that when we enter an attraction, we can leave the category id value unspecified. As a result, the attractions that were already entered can remain without an assigned category, avoiding any inconsistencies. We save and press F5 again. The warnings are gone. We see that now the category id attribute that is in attraction can take null values, so we will be able to create or modify attractions without having to assign them a category. Let's press the Reorganize button to accept what GeneXus proposes and continue with the execution. Let's insert some categories. Since the category id attribute was defined based on the id domain, and that domain has the autonumber property set to true, we don't have to enter a value for the identifier. It will be automatically numbered. We will call it museum. And we add now this other one, historical site. Now let's run the attraction transaction. We'll add categories to the attractions we created earlier. Let's start by setting the Louvre Museum as a museum. If we remember the category identifier number, we could type it directly. Another option is to select it from a list by clicking on this icon. Note that this list shows all the categories we've entered. So far, only 2. We choose the first one, museum. We can see that the category identifier 1 is now assigned, and the category name is displayed below. We can't modify it because it is the inferred attribute. Let's complete the work and assign the historical site category to the Great Wall. Since we know by heart that it corresponds to ID 2, we type it. And indeed, it brings the name we expected. If now we want to remove this category because we're not convinced, and we prefer to leave it unassigned for the moment, we can see that this is perfectly allowed. On the other hand, what will happen if we enter a non-existent category identifier? It warns us, and will not allow us to save this change in the database. In short, when we enter here a value other than empty and leave the field, the transaction transparently enforces referential integrity by going to the category table to look for the record with this ID. If it exists, it retrieves the category name value, which is the one we see displayed, and allows saving. If the record does not exist, then it displays the error message and does not allow saving. And what will happen if we want to delete the historical site category? The transaction doesn't allow it. If it did, the attraction, the Great Wall, would reference a category that no longer exists. That would leave an orphaned reference, making the database inconsistent. Note then that to delete a record from category, the transaction transparently performs a lookup in the attraction table to verify that no attraction references the category you want to delete. Let's see that if we add a new category and try to delete it, the deletion will not fail. In sum, when GeneXus finds 2 transactions with attributes that have the same name, where one of those attributes is the identifier of one of the 2 transactions and not of the other, it interprets that in the latter, the attribute is referencing or pointing to a record in the other. This attribute will be stored in the table but with a special role, that of foreign key. The other repeated attribute will be a secondary attribute in this transaction. It will be physically stored in its own table, so it will be inferred in this other transaction. This means it will not be present in that table. Instead, its value will be retrieved from the reference table through the foreign key. Based on these relationships between entities, GeneXus adds all the necessary code to both transactions to ensure referential integrity is always enforced.